Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's seminar on Good Jobs Challenge in Developing Countries. And we are delighted to have today with us Professor Kunal Sen, who is the Director of United Nations University, WIDER, and is a leading international expert on political economy of growth and development. He has undertaken extensive research on international finance, political economy, of determinants of inclusive growth, dynamics of poverty and social exclusion, apart from looking at female labor force participation in informal sector in a number of developing countries, especially India, East Asia, and in sub-Saharan Africa. He has published widely in journals and also has co-edited and edited a number of books. Today, he's going to discuss with us the challenges faced by developing countries in creating good jobs. Despite efforts, about 80% of the workforce in Africa and South Asia still engage in precarious and poorly compensated jobs in the informal sector. He's going to draw today from his co-edited book, The Job Ladder, Transforming Informal Work in Livelihoods in Developing Countries, which is based on very rich empirical analysis. He's going to present some of those findings where they try to explain why informality prevails in many of the global South countries. He'll also explore some questions around how workers in the informal sector move up the job ladder towards better paid opportunities, how their livelihoods can be transformed, and what policy interventions can be quite effective in improving the livelihoods for these informal workers and households in these countries. His presentation will be followed by a panel discussion, and we have three eminent experts from the ILO to take on some questions later. But before that, without undue delay, I'd like to hand over the floor to Professor Kunal Sen, and you have about 30 to 35 minutes. Thanks, Professor Kunal.
Thank you, Uma, for the kind introduction. It's really a privilege to be here. This particular book that I'll be presenting on has been very much influenced by work that's happened in the ILO for many years. And in fact, many of the concepts we're speaking about are drawn from really the work that we have seen in measuring informality and concepts of informality that we've seen in the ILO. So it's a real pleasure to be here. So the book that I'll be speaking about is a book that has just been published by Oxford University Press. It's part of this series that we have with OUP, Oxford University Press, called the Wider Series in Development Economics, which goes back a long way, about 30 years. And the book is open access. So if you were to go to the UNE Wider website, right on the very front page itself, is the link to the book itself, can be downloaded for free. So please do take a look at the book because it's now available in the public domain. So what I'll be speaking about is really to try and synthesize this book. As I'll explain in a few minutes, we have several different country studies here. I can't present every country study. I'll present the overall findings and also the methodology I've used to try and think about this question about informality in developing countries. Next slide. The background context, and this is very common, this is common knowledge in the ILO, is that we have a situation where, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, perhaps less so in East Asia, Latin America, informal forms of economic activity remain a persistent phenomena in spite of rapid economic growth that has happened in recent decades, both in Africa and also in South Asia. Informal employment now constitutes more than 60% of total global employment using ILO data. In Africa, for instance, 8 out of every 10 workers are working informally. 8 out of every 10 workers is a very large proportion. Also, we know that micro, small, informal, and household-run enterprises employ a large share of the workflows. So self-employment is a very large category in informal employment and provide livelihoods for the poor. At the same time, there's a very strong gender dimension to informality. Women are more likely to engage in precarious forms of informal work, such as contributing family workers, unpaid workers, in enterprises headed by males in the households. It's a very common phenomenon, particularly in Africa and Asia and South Asia, or in poorly paid casual jobs in the informal sector. Now, just to sort of thinking about a situation where we have particularly in Africa and South Asia, but also in East Asia and Latin America, a situation where almost every other work you're going to see is going to be in the informal sector, working informally. In that kind of context, where formal employment is a very small proportion of total employment, we need to start thinking a bit more creatively about informality. And we need to recognize that there is a lot of heterogeneity in formal work. And informal work takes many different forms and plays very different roles in all these different countries in the global south. So for example, in lower middle income countries, it is often a place of residual employment for impoverished, marginalized, and vulnerable workers, but also, next point, can also act as a staging ground for household enterprises in the initial stages of growth. It could be essentially a residual employment situation where you cannot find work in the formal sector. It could also be a place where you see self-employed, especially small household enterprises, increase and grow over time and potentially enter the formal sector, perhaps over several years, after several years. So we can see both of this kind of phenomena. So what we're going to try and do in this, we've got to do this book, is to try and capture this heterogeneity. And we're going to use particular classifications to think about this because of the complexity of informal work and the heterogeneity of informal work. And what we're going to try and do is think about how exactly to classify informal work, given that majority of workers in the global south are in the informal sector. Next slide. So what exactly are we talking about? So informal workers could be multidimensionally deprived individuals of subsistence activities at the lower end of the labor market. So household enterprises, casual wage workers. We're going to call them lower tier informal workers enterprises. So lower tier is like signifying right at the bottom of the so-called job ladder. But there are also workers, informal workers, who could be entrepreneurs with potential to enter the formal economy. These are non-household enterprises or employers in the ILO definition, and workers with de facto benefits, but without legal protection and social protection that we know are characteristics of work in the formal sector or formal employment. We call them upper tier informal workers enterprises. One intuition behind the difference could be that those with the lower tier of the labor market or the job ladder are essentially free entry work. This kind of work, you don't need any kind of skills or any professional training or any capital, while those in the upper tier of the informal labor market are where we have some entry barriers. And so this could be a way to think about lower tier, upper tier work. Along with this difference between lower tier and upper tier informality, there's also important difference between wage employment and self-employment, because wage employment and self-employment have different working conditions and different compensation mechanisms. And we need to keep these two categories, wage employment and self-employment, separately. And we'll see why that's important in the analysis of the book itself. So again, to summarize, in the informal labor market or informal workers, we see upper tier work, whether wage employed or self-employed, and we see lower tier work, whether wage employed or self-employed. We're going to try and show you how we can use this concepts to try and to measure the data sets we have for labor force surveys and try to understand this over time. Moving on, next slide. So just an example, this is fieldwork that I've been doing over the last few years. So for example, this is two pictures from one from India and the other from Nairobi. Nairobi was very recently. So the left-hand side of this picture, you can see what we call self-employment upper tier. In this case, this is a household enterprise that I interviewed in Karnataka, in somewhere outside Bangalore. And here the house enterprise, this is a non-house enterprise. In other words, the person owning this, a female owner, is employing women from outside the household. There were at least 3 women here working in the enterprise who are not members of the household. On the right-hand side, we see a lady selling fruits and vegetables. And here she's working by herself, and she's a fruit vendor. And in this example, for lower tier self-employed. So this is an example of upper tier and lower tier self-employed. It's just examples, of course, and there are many other different ways of this can happen in different contexts. Moving on. Wage employment also has this upper tier and lower tier part. Upper tier often, for example, in this picture that we have on the left-hand side, upper tier are contract workers. This is again an Indian company having contract workers working here, carpenters, plumbers, and so on. They do not have the kind of protection the formal workers get, but they're also not in a situation where they do not get any de facto benefits whatsoever. So these are upper tier wage employed. On the right-hand side of this of the picture here, there's a construction workers. If anybody's been to India, for example, cities, you see these construction workers really have no protection whatsoever in casual wage work, often getting employed on a day-to-day basis. So it's an example of a lower tier wage employed. It's again, as I said, examples that we're using here to illustrate this concepts. Moving on. So then, what is the book trying to do then? What the book tries to do is use a range of countries in the global south, and we'll discuss which countries they are. The book examines heterogeneity within informal work, applying a common conceptual framework, which is very important for us. We were very important that we were not comparing apples and oranges. We're trying to have a common conceptual framework and a common empirical methodology to try and study heterogeneity in informal work across very different country contexts. And we're going to try and show you how we try and do that. A unique feature of the book was that we wanted to understand mobility or transitions, but understand how do workers move from different categories, whether from wage employment to self-employment, or whether from lower tier to upper tier, or whether from upper tier to formal, or even from formal wage employment, for example, to lower tier, upper tier wage employment or lower tier wage employment. So we were interested in looking at transitions because we don't know much about this thing. So what is the likelihood a worker moves up or moves down the job ladder? So we were absolutely clear that we had to use panel data. That, of course, meant that we had to limit the kind of countries we could work with. But as it turned out, we had quite a few countries in the book that we could have where we had panel data. So what we do then, for all the countries we're going to study, we're going to classify all jobs into 6 work status classification. This is really important. You have formal self-employment, formal wage employment, upper tier informal self-employment, lower tier informal self-employment, upper tier informal wage employment, and lower tier informal wage employment, 6 categories. So formal, upper tier informal, lower tier informal, and then wage versus self-employment. And we're going to try and look at the transitions from the 6 categories over time using panel data. And by doing so, we can identify which status work status is the most persistent. In other words, if you enter that work status, you're less likely to move out, whichever way you go, up or down, and which is the most mobile. So if you are in that work status, it's probably you may not be able to be there for maybe a year or a couple of years, and you're more likely to move up or move down. And whether there are differences in rates of persistence or mobility across regions. So it's really important to understand, is there a difference? There a difference between a country in Latin America, it's a country in Asia, and a country in Southern Africa, or Middle East, North Africa, in looking at mobility and persistence across work status. So who moves up or down and why? That was a very important question we wanted to answer. So just to give a simple explanation of this kind of in a figurative way, next slide. So we have here a multi-tiered labor market in a typical developing country, 6 categories: informal, upper tier, lower tier, wage and self-employment, and the formal. And of course, formal, we could define formal, but regulation and so on come in between formal and informal. And the questions we want to answer in using these 6 categories are the following. And moving on, next slide. So who moves up or down and why? How frequent are the transitions? How transformative are the transformations? Does it really matter if you move up or down? And so while, of course, we have an interest in the mobility from the informal to the formal, which is what most of us have studied in economics, clearly also the important thing to understand also is movement within categories, in other words, lower to upper tier, or upper tier, lower tier, but also wage to self-employment and vice versa. So all these are very important. So the movements here, and it's important to highlight here that the movement can be any direction. There's nothing that says that if you go up to the formal sector, formal employment, you're going to stay there. Nothing that says that that's the case. And we'll see, in fact, that's not the case. Same time, moving on, next slide, and next point. We also want to understand these movements within categories, work status categories. So are we moving up, moving down? What's the likelihood of moving down? What's the likelihood of moving up? And of course, also the movement between categories. In other words, self-employment and wage employment. This is also very important for us to understand. So it's quite a complex way of thinking about it, but we have the data to do that, and I'll show you exactly what we find in the different country studies. So again, next point. So just to summarize the questions we're going to answer, who moves up or down and why? Question 1. Question 2, how frequent are the transitions? Question 3, how transformative are the transitions? Now here on transformative, I need to be clear that in the data sets we're using with the labor force surveys, we can only look at income. We can't look at livelihoods. We can't look at subjective perceptions of moving up or down. So we're using labor force surveys, and really it's income that we can measure quite reliably here. So that's important to keep in mind. So moving on, which are the countries we have? So we have 20 countries. So in Central Latin America, where we have many countries with panel data, Argentina, Brazil, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Mexico, Nicaragua, Paraguay, and Peru, 8 countries. And you can see several from Central America and several from Latin America. I should say to you that for this set of countries, we had panel data goes over 2 decades of data, panel data. In many countries, we have rotating panels. In other countries, we have single panels, workers have followed over 20 years. So remarkably rich panel data in the Central America and in Latin America. That's a very unusual feature of these countries. Sub-Saharan Africa, we have 6 countries: Ghana, Mali, Niger, Nigeria, South Africa, and Tanzania. Again, you can see we have both Francophone Africa and Anglophone Africa. And again, it's important to keep in mind that we have countries across the entire Sub-Saharan African region. 6, because in Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, panel data is very difficult to get. And we were struggling, but we managed to find these countries which had panel data, at least 2 rounds, 2 waves. And sometimes, of course, in some countries, much more than that. And then Middle East and North Africa, where again, panel data is difficult to find. We had 3 countries: Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia. And then Asia, China, India, and Indonesia. And we also have panel data. So 20 countries, and as I said, panel data was very important criteria selection countries, but we also wanted to get the coverage of countries across the global south. And we feel particularly pleased that we have countries now from almost all the global south, and also in a very different states of economic development. Other thing I should say that all the country chapters that we have all been co-authored by country specialists. In all the cases, the country papers are written by country authors, in-country authors. That was very important for us because they needed to give us local context, which obviously was very important for us. Okay, so now really the big question is, next slide, how do we classify work status? So the first one is relatively straightforward because we need to make a decision informal and formal employment. And we know with the ILO's work, this is relatively straightforward, right? We use the ILO definition. Informal employment is understood as work that lacks any type of legal recognition or protection, and work where workers do not have secure employment contracts, workers' benefits, social protection, or workers' representation. If a worker does not have the work doesn't have legal recognition, protection, or the workers do not have secure employment contracts, workers' benefits, social protection, or workers' representation, that worker is an informal worker. So that's the criteria we use, which implies that within self-employment, we have formal self-employment, which are those enterprises that are registered with national state authorities, for example, social security, sales income tax authorities. So any enterprise, self-employed, or registered with any national state authority are classified as formal self-employed. And by definition, any which are not registered are those who are informal self-employed. Within wage employed, formal wage employment are workers who have secure employment contracts, workers' benefits, social protection, or workers' representation. And by definition, those who do not are informal wage employed. So that's the way we look at formal and informal. But the next classification is more tricky, and this is where one has to be a bit more careful. That's a classification to do with upper and lower tier. And so what we did here is that first, let's talk about upper tier, informal self-employed. So upper tiers of informal self-employed are self-employed workers with unregistered business activities, because of course they are informal, who either employ at least one person, so not a household enterprise, so not a household member, also somebody in the enterprise, at least one is not a household member, or in activities that require some type of professional training, defined as ISCO, groups 1 to 4, covering managers, professionals, technicians, clerks. While those which are household enterprises, so own account workers, or which do not have any professional training, are classified as lower tier informal self-employed. Now, it's important to understand why household and non-household. This is work I've been doing for several years now. The transition from an enterprise's own household, own account, to one that becomes employer is a huge transition. There's a huge productivity benefits that happens there. This is something that is one I have observed in many my earlier work. And that's so very simple, because the moment you employ someone outside the household, you could pay the person some wage or some kind of payment, possibly in cash. And often that implies some kind of productivity jump that happens when you do that. So the difference between own account versus employer, there's a very big difference that happens there, which is why we think those who are employers, in other words, employing somebody outside the household, are essentially informal upper tier, and those who are not are informal lower tier. And professional training is also important, because the moment you have some kind of skill, that makes you also more employable in the labor market. And again, there's a big difference for those who have some skills, some training, versus those who do not. And that, again, why we use this as a way to classify them, workers with some professional training in these scope groups 1 to 4 as upper tier, while those who do not are lower tier. Contributing family workers is obvious, they're classified as lower tier informal, irrespective of nature of the enterprise. Among the wage employees, those who are not formal, not covered by social protection, et cetera, those who are in some type of professional training, again, plumbers, carpenters, and so on. So in other words, you need some skills that you need to have, are classified upper tier. And those who do not have any professional training, are classified as lower tier. Also, if a worker has some kind of written employment agreement, even though they're formal, they have some kind of a written employment agreement, or have de facto benefits, such as paid sick leave or maternity leave, we classify them as upper tier. Best example of this, at least in the context I work in, is in India, are contract workers. These workers are not formal, but they do get some kind of de facto benefits. And so those who do not have that, we classify them lower tier. So which means that the classification schema, next slide, is the following. It's the following. Sorry, this is a slide a bit difficult to read, but imagine, we're looking at the entire working age population, employed, unemployed, out of the labor force, that's pretty obvious. And within the employed, we have two categories, self-employed and wage employed. And within the self-employed, we have those who are listed with national authorities, who are then upper tier, informal self-employed. And if they're not registered, then we look at them again in terms of the professional, but whether they are employing at least one person. Sorry, those who are not registered are informal. And within that category, whether you employ at least one person outside the household, or whether you're in activity that requires some type of professional training, if that happens, then you're upper tier. If that doesn't happen, you're lower tier. On the wage employment situation, if you are covered by social protection and so on, you're formal. If you're not, you're informal. And again, within informal wage employment, if you need some kind of professional training, or you have de facto benefits, you're upper tier. If not, you're lower tier. Now, this classification scheme, in the 20 countries we looked at, we allowed the country authors to have some discretion, because it was sometimes difficult. It's a tricky judgment call, though we kept a very strong, tight control over how that happened, because we did not want to have, as I was saying, an apples versus oranges comparison. So in most cases, I would say the classification done fairly cleanly. There were sometimes judgment calls to make in certain cases, but by and large, we were confident that when the country authors were classifying workers, generally they got it right. And as I said, we went through several iterations of this to make sure the classification was done quite well. In some country, some kind of data sets, sometimes classification were a little bit trickier, but generally, I think we got it right in most cases, and that's something we feel very pleased about. So moving on. So here's an example of job ladder. A job ladder, and this particular diagram I'm showing is Costa Rica. I can show this diagram for all the countries we have, and they look similar in one important respect. They look similar in that if you're formal, you're always going to have higher incomes than if you're informal. And if you're informal, if you're upper tier, we're always going to have higher incomes than if you're lower tier. That linearity is always the same across countries, and the non-monetarity. But what is interesting is that within formal, which work category gets paid highest, wage employed or self-employed, differs country by country. Within informal, which category is paid the least, wage employed or self-employed, differs country by country. And also the steepness of the ladder differs country by country. In some countries, this ladder is very steep. In others, you move up the ladder, your incomes are going to increase quite sharply. In other countries, the ladder is slightly less steep, but never a situation where If in the informal categories, you're going to earn higher incomes than the formal categories. That has not happened in any of the country case studies. So that's an interesting thing that we find, and I'll give you some examples in different countries that we look at afterwards. On the work status classification example, now from Sub-Saharan Africa, just to very quickly to point out that in Sub-Saharan Africa, except for South Africa, the proportion of workers in informal self-employment is very large. Not so much wage employment, but informal self-employment. South Africa's exception, as you can see, the orange bar, you can see, so South Africa, most workers are in formal wage employment. South Africa's job ladder or its work status classification is very different from other African countries. And that's important to keep in mind. That's to do with the nature of the way the system and labor market works in South Africa compared to other sub-Saharan African countries. Moving on, now we have examples. So we did this, we did the job ladder diagram, we did this work status classification, and we did this transition matrices. So next slide, this is for India, for every country. So every country, if you look at the book, you'll find all these examples for different, all these countries, all of them are there. India, here, this transition matrix, what you're seeing here are two interesting things. You're seeing the highest category, the formal wage employment, there is a, and this is the one that comes in fourth in this diagram, formal wage employment, the yellow bar, you can see a lot of persistence. Very little movement down, very little movement in other category. On the other hand, if you're lower informal wage employed, right at the bottom, is very, very high persistence. In other words, almost very unlikely that you're in that category, you're going to move up or across the job ladder. In other words, it's very unlikely that you're going to move into self-employment or you're going to move up to upper tier of wage employment or formal wage employment. But this persistence we see is kind of almost like a polarized situation where there's a lot of persistence at top and a lot of persistence at the bottom of the job ladder and mobility in between. But again, this is something, this is specific to India, but we see something similar for some of the other countries, so I'll get back to that. Okay, so next slide, I'm going to try and summarize very quickly. Does a classification work as a job ladder? Yes. There is a clear ordering of job status by earnings that is common to all countries. Formal, upper tier, informal, lower tier informal. That ordering is common all across countries. That doesn't change. Next slide. Then in that case, what can we say about the job ladder across different countries? The top are formal workers, but interestingly, between wage and self-employment, in some countries, formal self-employment is the one with highest earnings, but in some other countries, it's formal wage employment. Do we see continental differences? Not so clear. Look, Latin America, more likely that a formal self-employed earns the highest. While you can see for formal wage employment, Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and then India is also in that category, earns the highest. So it's not obvious that there are continental differences, but there is some of that in the Latin American case where formal self-employment seems to earn the highest compared to formal wage employment. But generally, of course, formal workers, as you may expect, are paid the most. Then the next one is the bottom of the ladder. The bottom of the ladder, next slide, is the lower tier informal. That's pretty clear, but again, we find that which of the two, wage employment, self-employment, does seem to differ across countries and across regions. So again, if you have to sort of say what the continental findings are, you can see that lower tier informal wage employment is least paid in Latin America as compared to Africa, Asia, and the middle South Africa. So again, we're seeing some of differences that are happening in the job ladder in terms of which particular category within the work status that seems to have some kind of continental properties. So that's also quite interesting. Moving on. So as I said, that formal wage employment is not a category that we see in Sub-Saharan Africa or in Asia, except South Africa. In South Africa, formal wage employment is the largest work status, along with Latin America. So this too, so South Africa and Latin America, formal wage employment is the largest, is a work status where most workers are found generally. And that's interesting because that says that it's not the case that formal wage employment is something we don't tend to see in the global South. We do see that But we seem to see it's very much concentrated in Latin America and also in South Africa. Then if you look at the other categories, next slide, we see that in sub-Saharan Africa, outside of South Africa, lower tier informal self-employment is the largest work status. So outside of South Africa, which is formal wage employment, lower tier informal employment is the largest work status. And that's also interesting because that's not what we tend to find in the case of Asia or even the Middle East, North Africa, where we seem to see it's informal lower tier wage employment. So that's another interesting difference we see across regions. Moving on. So then the next, then I'm just going to try and sort of slightly hurry up here because I'm a little bit behind time. But also the thing that's interesting here is that formal self-employment is not something we seem to find in the data. There are very few workers in formal self-employment. A little bit more Latin America, as you can see, but generally it's all less than 10%. And that's interesting because we have this vision of formal employment where all the entrepreneurs are moving into this work status classification, but we don't seem to see that in the data. So that is one category where it's true across the regions that we don't find too many workers. Moving on. What about upper tier work? Upper tier informal wage employment is pretty large in China, India, and Latin America. Not so in Sub-Saharan Africa. And in contrast, in Sub-Saharan Africa, there's very low upper tier informal wage employment. So upper tier seems to be, again, not something we seem to see in Sub-Saharan Africa. See a lot of lower tier informal, mostly self-employment. The upper tier is very much a property of Latin America and also Asia. And that's, again, very interesting because upper tier at least is the way to climb up the job ladder to some extent. And again, that's interesting that we see these differences. Now, moving on. So really the question that we were quite interested in asking is that if you're a lower tier informal worker, is that a dead-end job? So is it very likely that if you're a lower tier informal, you're going to stay there pretty much all through your working career, and possibly generationally also, your children might also be in the same category. So the answer to that is yes, depending on which particular category you're looking at. If you're looking at lower tier informal employed, it is a dead end in China, Indonesia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, except South Africa. On the other hand, it is not a dead end in India, Latin America, and South Africa. In India, Latin and South Africa, we tend to see more mobility from this particular category, both upwards or across the wage employment. On the other hand, as I said, for China, Indonesia, Sub-Saharan Africa, if you're a lower tier informal employed, it is very likely that you will not either move up or move across. So that's interesting about lower tier informal self-employment. What about lower tier informal wage employment? Next slide. Here, again, we find that it is a dead end in 2 Sub-Saharan African countries and also in India. So in this country, in India, we already saw the figure for that. In these countries, if you're lower tier informal wage employed, you're very unlikely to move up or move across. You're stuck in that category. On the other hand, if you're in China and Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Ghana, South Africa, so a lot of Latin American countries are here, but also South Africa and China, we tend to see more mobility here. So I think the point here is that we need to be very careful here because we're seeing differences both across continents and within continents on mobility. It is not obvious that if you look at any particular country, you can say ex ante where you expect to see more mobility from the lower tier, the ones that are paid the least, to either up or across. It is not obvious at all, and we need to obviously look at the data for this. Okay, now let me move on to the last few slides on what I want to say. And the category which I think is very interesting is upper tier informal wage employment, because this is the category where we see a lot of mobility. In this category, we see both movement up or movement down. In fact, in Latin America, if you're an upper tier, it's very likely that you can move up to formal wage employment over time. While if you're in Sub-Saharan Africa, Ghana, Uganda, it's very likely that you will move down. So this is the category that's the most volatile, the least persistent, and movements can either be upwards, depending on where you are, which country, or downwards. And that's interesting about this particular category. This category is a category which could be seen as a transition state, not a destination. A destination seems to be the lower tier and the formal wage employed. Those are destination states. Those states, if you are there, you pretty much stay there, and not the upper tier category. And finally, on the transition work status, formal wage employment, as one might expect, is the most persistent work status. Once you're there, you are there. You do not move from there. In fact, we hardly saw any downward mobility from formal wage employment across all the 20 countries, hardly any movement down. On the other hand, formal self-employment, we did see movements downwards. So we did see movement downwards from formal employment to informal self-employment, upper tier or lower tier. So formal wage employment is probably the most desired situation if you do get to that, because it's very unlikely they'll ever get out of that, at least in the countries that we looked at. And so what that also means is that if you do have large formal wage employment, you're more likely to see workers be able to move into that category from upper tier informal. So if you have a large formal wage employment, as we saw in Latin America and South Africa, you're more likely to see workers move into that category than in a situation like in Sub-Saharan Africa, South Africa, or in Asia, where this particular category is very small. That's again important to keep in mind, because mobility doesn't seem to be happening in countries where there is to the highest category, highest work status, if you do not have a large formal wage employment. And that's something that is also quite striking. Okay, so in terms of what really drives what are the correlates of mobility? This is not causal. These are correlates. It's pretty obvious that higher education makes a difference. It's pretty obvious that if you have vocational training, either on the job or if you had it from before, makes a difference. Age makes a difference. If you're not too young, not too old, and gender makes a difference. Women are much less likely to move up than men. So we see very clear roles of education, vocational training, age, of course, and that's pretty obvious. If you're too young, you still don't have the education. If you're too old, it's difficult to move up or move down, move across. And of course, gender makes a big difference. So we see also, but the point here is that these are correlates. We're not trying to make a causal statement here, but it's important to keep in mind that education, age, and gender are very important here. So let me come to the last slide here. And I think the point that I want to make in this last slide is that one of the problems that I've often found in the work of informality is that we tend to see informality the same lens across different country contexts, in many cases. And I think the argument that I think we should think about here is that different policies are needed for different segments of the job ladder. And that will depend a lot on country by country analysis, because the size of each segment and the possibility of transition differs a lot across countries, even within the same continent. So we see these big striking differences across continents, but also within continents, in terms of different countries having very different possibilities of transition with the same continent. For example, if you see countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, except South Africa, and also India, we seem to see these countries with high levels and rates of persistence in lower tier informal work. So in this kind of countries, the argument that we should try to get work in the formal employment doesn't seem to make much sense to me, really, because what's really important here is try to get these workers in lower tier status to the upper tier status, because formal wage employment or formal self-employment is something that may not happen for most of these workers in lower tier work status. On the other hand, in countries with high levels of upper tier informal work and high mobility, which are mostly Latin America, but also South Africa, expanding the formal sector and providing protection to upper tier workers should take priority. In other words, the point here really is that if you're in a country with most workers in lower tier work, whether wage employment or self-employment, and the workers tend to be in this work status for a very long time, if it's persistent, then it's really important to try and think about that particular work status in the ways we think about trying to do something informality. On the other hand, if you're in a situation where a lot of workers are in upper tier work, less so lower tier work, and we see mobility, upwards or downwards, mostly upwards in many cases, then clearly the argument should be that the lower tier is not as important to think about as the upper tier, And the idea would be trying to increase the number of workers moving upper tier informal work to formal work, potentially formal wage employment. So these are very different contexts, and we have to think about what makes sense in one country would not make sense in some other country. And I think that's important to keep in mind. There's several other policies that we have also looked at in this book. I'm not going to get into that. Generally, I think what I would like to highlight, the thing I want to highlight here is that we need to keep in mind the informal work is highly heterogeneous. We need to keep in mind that heterogeneity differs across countries, and therefore need to keep in mind how should we think about the job ladder in different parts of the world where we see very different rates of mobility and also very different levels of workers in different kinds of different work status. I think that's the point I want to finish with. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Kunal Sen, for this fascinating and interesting presentation, which is very rich with very good analysis. And I think one thing that you have labored all through the presentation is the heterogeneity of informal work. This is something that we at the ILO keep talking about almost in many of the policy dimensions that we talk about. But I think what I see as a very important contribution of this book is how you've taken forward the 1970s Professor Gary Field's approach of looking at lower tier and upper tier informal employment, because this is something we've been discussing with him for, I think, decades in a way. So it's interesting to see how you have actually taken that approach and applied that conceptual approach and framework systematically across a range of countries using panel data sets and tried to see what the movements are. And I think one thing I found it very interesting is how you very clearly identify which countries are dead end for informal workers, which countries have a potential for them to transition and move. And that brings me to the question saying, okay, what's been the role of policies? I very clearly see that you highlighted a couple of things saying, this is what has been happening in these countries, which might be actually leading them to move towards, transitioning upwards. But I think there's a lot more that is probably happening there. And I was just wondering whether as part of a panel discussion, we could actually unpack a bit at the policy level, what the countries have been doing, what are the issues, and how we can actually talk about transitioning workers from informality to formality. So for that, I have three eminent colleagues from mine from the ILO, Roger Gomez, who's a labor market modeling officer from the statistics department, Sarah Razavi, who's the director, social protection department, and Juan Chacaltana, senior employment policy specialist from the employment department. So I'm going to start with you, Roger. Okay, so one of the things that you see in this book is the use of the ICLS definition, the 17th ICLS definition, basically. And the book basically proposes three distinct approaches to looking at this entire issue of upper tier and lower tier. And then what it goes about doing is picking one of them and going about doing systematic analysis across a range of countries. Now, I want you to open it a bit up and look at some of the disadvantages or advantages of using such an approach for analysis, because I think there are lots of merits that are there if you look at different approaches that are there. And what does it mean from a cross-country comparative perspective, basically? Because one thing we all know is that, and I think Kunal very clearly mentioned, there are not many panel data sets that are there for us to look at transitions per se. So, using this kind of an approach, where can it lead to, what it can do, because some of it is also not national level. So, what does it mean for us from a policy angle?
Yes, thank you for this question. It is very interesting. First, I want to start highlighting the progress in measurement, because the book uses the 17th ICLS. A few years ago, it was not common to use a common framework to have these measurements harmonized. So we are very glad to see that these concepts are flowing through to the academic world. Typically, studies used to have employee versus self-employed as a rough proxy of informality. So it's great to see that the lessons of comparability are being learned and applied. So we are very happy to see that. Also, the use of panel data as a data analyst, I think it's very interesting. It's one of the difficult to access types of data set. We have a lot of cross-section. We do have some panel data, but it's hard to process. The rotating sample decreases the power. So it's very nice to see this application. And also kind of the standard type of setting. So in each, it's a mini ICLS, this exercise of trying to harmonize what we do in different countries, which is certainly more helpful than go on a country by country basis. So I think that's a very interesting exercise in that sense. The lower upper split based on this ease of access, I think it's a positive contribution in the sense of unpacking this heterogeneity of informality, because if a country has 80% of informality, saying that a worker is informal, it's not that informative. And trying to have this sort of normative implication with one higher than the other, it's very relevant policy-wise. Of course, it runs into the same limitations that we have to do this sort of exercise in general, not just for informal workers. We would be pressed to say what exactly is an upper or lower worker in general, and that's also true in informality, which brings me to a bit to the drawbacks or the comparability limitations when we do these exercises. But that's not to say that this is particular about this. I mean, this is what always happens when you try to do a sort of a normative implication from a labor force survey. It's kind of the natural limitations. One thing is, for instance, the use of the written contract. Clearly, I think it can be argued that it's normatively, it's positive to have a written contract over not having it. However, if that throws you into a different path completely on the decision tree, some people will find cases of misclassification. Let's say, oh, why this person is in the upper tier just because he has a written contract. Cross-country comparability in this type of indicators is very rough, because maybe in some countries it's very typical to have these written contracts, in others not, and it doesn't make a lot of difference in terms of work conditions or earnings. This is pretty typical about most of variables in a labor force survey, so that's why it's very tricky to do these normative definitions. But again, if we combine it with the panel data and we see that certain states are absorbing, well, this shows us that we are onto something, because there's kind of a wall there. So the better, the more self-absorbing states we find, actually, the more meaningful the classification is. So in that sense, we see that in practice, there's quite a bit of power to these classifications. A bit maybe too much into the details, but I'm from statistics, so I have to say it. The ISCO classification, perhaps I would have used the skill levels, not using the clerk category in there, because the clerk versus machinery operator, for us, it's the same skill level, whereas it's true that 1, 2, 3 major digit groups would be more of higher skill, typically associated with having undergraduate degree or more. With that, there's the exception of the management. So digit 1, which we see across countries, very different practices. So in some countries, it really means to be a manager, but in some countries, owning a shop puts you into the manager category. So I would perhaps take 2 and 3 and be very careful with the category 1 in general. And the final point I would make on this measurement issue is the own use production. A lot of these lower tier informal workers, whether self-employed or wage employee, but particularly self-employed, could be categorized as just working on subsistence. And that seems like a very different group from any other type of informal worker, regardless of whether they are upper tier or lower tier. It's just people doing subsistence farming. So I guess this would be very interesting to see the transitions. I would venture that it will be a very absorbing state that you end up there if you start there, and it's very hard to get out. And that's it from my end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Roger. In some sense, what you're trying to say that when we don't see certain transitions, it has a lot to do with the definitional aspect, what is going into it, and has nothing to do with, whether it's a better job or not, or whether you're aspiring to go elsewhere. And I think this is something very important for us to keep in mind as we get into a policy discussion. One of the other things that came out of the presentation was the challenges that many developing countries face in creating formal sector jobs. And that was, irrespective of the continent that one is looking at. And often it is suggested that growth is the answer. However, we do know that growth per se can reduce or increase informality, but it again depends upon a number of other things, like it could be the economic structure, the institutions, the kind of policies that are being put in place and all of that. So Juan, you coming from the Employment Policy Department, what do you think are some of the issues when we are tackling this whole question of informality? What is important if we are really thinking about transitioning workers from the informal to formal? And can you sort of give us a flavor from the countries that you've been working on as you know what works and what does not work?
Okay, thank you. And also, please let me start by congratulating the professor and the authors in this big effort of trying to put together so many studies and using panel data, actually, which is very innovative. But so I will put my question first and then I will elaborate. The question is, are these transitions influenced by the context in which they were, collected, or the surveys were collected? So I will come back to this because on your question, yes, what I was trying to explore how the different chapters dealt with these variables, economic variables, and I saw that it's very difficult. And when you try to introduce it, it's very difficult to get significant results of these variables. But yet, the book does conclude that economic growth, although important, is not sufficient to facilitate the transition to formality. And this happens because the empirical relationship between growth and informality is rather weak. In a recent paper that we have published in the ILO, we obtain a coefficient of minus 0.16. Roughly speaking, that would mean that you will need to grow 6 points to reduce 1 point of informality. So, and that has a lot of variation across regions and income levels. In Africa, the relationship is the weakest. In middle income countries, seems to be stronger, etc. So that is one element. The same paper also tests empirically if different sectors have the same potential to reduce informality, and the empirical results are that no, some sectors have more potential than others, and the effects is different. We also find that it's not the same sector everywhere. In some regions, it's some sector, in other regions, other sectors. But in any case, it means that moving or changing the economic structure could help facilitate the process of formal job creation. And to your question, Uma, so to give an example of the importance of the formal job creation, so let me talk about the very well-known episode of formalization in Latin America, which occurred between 2005 and 2015. So in 2005, in that period, the region generated 51 million jobs. 39 of them were formal jobs. So that was a big effort. And that, of course, influenced many transitions. And the episode ended in 2016, and now the informality increased again. So I don't know if the results that we see in Latin America will persist. But in any case, the discussion here, and this is a second question, on the relative weight of these variables. For example, in Latin America, studying this particular episode, you know, that 39 million jobs created only reduced 5 percentage points in informality. Ricardo Infante did a study, and he estimates that 60% of the reduction was due to economic factors, and the remaining 40% was due to individual or institutional factors. So what is your view on the influence of these other variables in the transitions of the book? So I will stop here as a first.
Thank you so much, Juan. That's super interesting. I think that leads me to something that I've been trying to ask Sarah even before, but I thought I'll hear from you before going there. So, you know, you're still in the whole issue around transitioning from informality to formality. And some of the academics, as well as the international organizations, have been basically arguing that, okay, why don't you think about incentives? And one of them is like, how about abolishing Social Security contributions and replacing that with general taxation, right? That's something that's taken quite a bit of wind at the moment and going about it. So what do you think the counter argument could be for that? Or do you agree with that kind of an approach? Because when you see some of these transitions or movements, you start wondering what is it that is happening? And especially in the context of COVID-19 pandemic, what does it look like? And I think one of the limitations of this book for me was, how is it that it comes out in 2023, doesn't really talk about COVID-19 pandemic, and then talks about these transitions. So I was a bit also perplexed with it, but that's for you to later answer, Kunal. But I'd like to hear from you, Sarah, about this.
Yeah, so thanks very much, Uma. I also want to join Juan and Roger to really congratulate Professor Sen for a very rich study. I think, you know, just looking at the range of countries, the kind of data you had with the panel data sets, you know, there was a lot there for us to really, I think, digest and learn from. Quite a sophisticated analysis looking at the diversities of the informal economy. From a social protection perspective, I would have liked to see a little bit more on social protection and how it can enable formalization and the shift and transition of workers from informality to formality. But I'll get to maybe Uma's question first, and then maybe in our discussion, the other issues can come out. I mean, I think one thing that came out of COVID was this realization that, oh, well, you know, all of these workers in the informal economy, whether wage employees or whether self-employed, who did not have any access to social protection and were in the informal economy, this was really a huge gap. And there was a growing consensus, I think, you know, among international organizations, international financial institutions, that really universal social protection is one of the mechanisms, one of the things we need to act upon. And yet, I think when we come to the point where we're trying to see, well, what kind of policies are being used to extend social protection, you come up against I think this argument that, you know, providing social protection, particularly if it is financed through a contributory social insurance system, that, you know, there are certain downsides to it in terms of employment. And I don't want to go too much into the sort of different schools of thought, but I think there is a kind of, it's useful to distinguish between a kind of demand side versus supply side theories that suggest that social protection policies can lead to greater informality. I think you have the kind of, I would say, older school, demand side school, and I think Gary Fields, you know, in the 70s used to write about this, who would see labor market regulations, if it is labor protection, minimum wage legislation, or social protection, as something that really creates, kind of raises the cost of employing workers, and therefore on the demand side, from the employer side, that this can really create the incentives for reducing, formal job opportunities. And since informal activities are not subject to regulatory protections, then there is an incentive to create jobs in the informal economy. And how, social protection is kind of portrayed in that, I don't want to go into the details, but it's essentially seen as a sort of distortionary mechanism. And I think the evidence on that, much of the research was looking more at minimum wage legislation as a form of labor protection. And I think the evidence was that, well, actually, there isn't much evidence to show that this is a factor that is responsible for informality or a sort of low job creation potential. And that, in fact, by having minimum wage legislation, you're actually able to have a lot of benefits in terms of, workers' well-being, standard of living, wages, and so forth. But I think more recently, particularly in light of the work of Santiago Levy, which I think has been very influential, and I think that has had quite a bit of influence with international financial institutions, is what I call the supply side approaches, where the focus is more on informal workers who choose to operate informally. And the argument, his argument is that in a social protection system where you have contributory social protection, and you have tax-financed social protection. And he gives the example in Mexico of Seguro Popular, which is a tax-financed form of health protection for almost 50% of the population that didn't have access to contributory system. That what you have with this mixed system is that you create, in a way, you're taxing those who are working through the contributory system, and at the same time subsidizing those who benefit through a tax-finance system. And this, in a way, gives incentives for informality. That's, I think, sort of Levy's argument. It's been taken up by certain officers of international organizations, international financial institutions, and so forth. And I think there are now a series of studies, very careful empirical studies, that are really questioning that. And I want to highlight a couple of them. One was a very careful analysis done by Enrique Serra and colleagues, which was commissioned by WIGO, and very carefully looked at how municipal by municipal, area by area, the expansion of Seguro Popular happened in Mexico, and looked at the evidence to see if it was accompanied by a growth in informality. And the evidence, actually very carefully done, this work shows that the evidence for that is just not there. In fact, the paper finds no robust evidence of a decrease in formal employment, suggesting that the attraction of Seguro Popular was not large enough to overcome the benefits of having a formal job. And also this argument is based on this idea that informal workers kind of choose to work informally, which again, I think based on the evidence you have provided, particularly of the lower tier informal workers, there's not really that element of choice. Very often that's not the case. And then another paper, which we have commissioned by Florencia Caligaro and Oscar Cetrangolo, which is now available on the ILO website. This also has a broader focus and looks at the evidence on the impact of reductions in social security contributions that many countries have done in this period of deregulation, and finds no evidence that this goes hand in hand with a growth of formality. So I think the evidence for this argument is quite weak. And in fact, what the paper shows is that social contributions are one of the main sources of financing for social security systems. And the evidence shows that this has not declined. So social security, contributory social security is not dying out, as sometimes, if one reads some of the World Bank, reports, one assumes this is a dying thing. That's not the case. The evidence shows that it has remained significant. And in fact, in 2019, it provided almost 20% of the total tax and contribution revenue, which financed social security. And also the evidence does not show a clear pattern between contribution rates and informal employment. In fact, the reduction of informality depends, as we know, on a range of other policies. And so it doesn't quite wash to see social security as being the cause of informality when we know that, there are many other policies that are in place. And my final point, and I'll stop there, Omar, is that any reduction also in social security contributions that happens, which does not produce the formality that is often claimed. So that doesn't happen. But on the negative side, it means there is less financing available to have, a proper universal system. And that loss of financing is often not compensated by having a so-called tax finance system that very often also depends on very regressive forms of taxation, value-added taxes, consumption taxes, and employers are effectively let off the hook and don't then contribute to the reproduction of labor. So let me stop here.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And this is so much helpful for us to know that there is evidence that is being built up to show that there's absolutely no correlation between, getting this out and improving formality. I'm going to come back to you, Roger, to where you stopped on the subsistence farming largely. I think it was very interesting because I think subsistence farming is one where you have a lot of unpaid labor, but there are different types of forms of unpaid labor that is there. And I was very happy to see that the framework actually looks at the contributing family workers within it. So where are we in the current discussion of the definition of informality with regard to the whole issue of unpaid labor? Because I do remember that it was out, it was in, there's some discussions that are happening, even including the last expert meeting we had in February. And what I want to know is what is really being captured with regard to the unpaid work data from a policy perspective. Why is it being done? Is it because you're thinking that, as part of the UN, because there's also an alignment with the UN SNA, and there's the idea that we need to capture what are the informal productive activities that are coming as part of the GDP. So, this is something that gets missed out quite a bit when we get into this entire informality debate. And, when you say that there are countries that are in the dead end, a large chunk of them are actually the unpaid laborers. So I think it would be good to hear a bit more about the discussions around that.
Thank you. So yes, this was, I would say, the main drive towards revising the informality standards. The February discussion took place. It was quite successful, I would say. And if everything goes well in October, there will be new standards on that. The key issue is that the employment definition has changed to be more strict and exclude certain forms of work from employment. And subsistence farming would be one of these forms of work that will be excluded from employment. This was in 2013. Now, 2 conferences after, we are adjusting the informality employment to match with this new employment definition. Before it was, so the current standard of informal employment would include subsistence farming, for instance. Parts of unpaid work are captured, parts not. It's not very well defined with the old standards, and the new just clarifies that question much more. The idea behind this first is to acknowledge the fact that this is a very different group from the rest of the economy, and it doesn't make sense to put them together in the same bag. And also the problem of cross-country practices, because how you treat this sort of workers, who you consider really employed or not, is not a binary choice. There's degrees. So if a country goes one route and another country goes the other, the employment results are not comparable, and the same with informality. So the idea is to be very explicit and have very clear rules on how to define this person, and if a person has not a important component of pay or profit, it's not considered in employment, it's considered on production work, and so on. And this links very well with the system of national accounts, which was one of the problems that this mismatch caused. We didn't have a definition or an agreed definition between system of national accounts and labor force surveys on what's the informal economy. So for instance, this was critical when computing productivity or sectoral contribution of GDP by informal workers. It cannot be properly computed if the labor input is not computed. properly. So this now will align these two definitions, so we will be able to get, for instance, productivity statistics by formal or informal work, which would be very important. And of course, it will change completely the numbers that we have. So this 60% that we are citing here from the ILO study will disappear because many of those are, of course, subsistence farming. So we will have this sort of the three groups separate. And well, let's see if it gets approved in October, but we have expectations that it will go.
So Roger, what you're saying is that if this gets adopted, then this entire analysis that has been done, where you see the job ladders, would also undergo a change.
Yes,
Yeah.
and everything that we have published for that matter on informality.
Oh, wow.
Figures. Yes,
Oh, wow,
like the
So-
2 billion worker, everything.
really? So
Yeah.
it's going to have a huge implications at the policy level then.
Yes, and I think it's relevant because, of course, it's such a different type of group that are there that it's worth separating and seeing, okay, what's for instance, if we are talking Africa not formalizing enough, is it because of subsistence farming being stagnant there or a growing formal sector going under? I mean, it's relevant, but of course, as data users, and I'm one of them, it's a bit tricky, these changes.
So that would also bring about a change in our, not a dead end and dead end in a way. It's because if you remove these categories off, then you might see some transitionings actually happening because of the huge numbers that you have, you probably don't see, but very interesting. Thank you so much. Coming back to you, Juan. At the macro level, at the country level, like, if you really have to think about transitioning from informality to formality, what do you think are the macroeconomic and sectoral policies that we might require to bring about a productive transformation of the economy? Because I don't think without that, we can get into it. So there's a lot of talk today about industrial policies. Industrial policies have come back into fashion in a way. So do you think countries are there already thinking about what needs to be done? And what would your thoughts be about that?
Okay, thank you again. Yes, let me elaborate first on the importance of this. And I think I would like to connect this with the interest of the book on the heterogeneity in informality. The focus of the book is yes, it is important to distinguish because informality is a phenomenon of great magnitude, but also of large heterogeneity, and policies applied to one sector or to one segment should not be the same. But I completely agree with that. Yet the book focuses more on individual or workers' heterogeneity. In some developing regions, there is another literature focusing more on productive heterogeneity. So, and that involves the discussion of recognizing that in one economy, there is a coexistence of segments that are highly productive at the frontier of technology, demanding a range of labor skills, together with very low productivity units. And I was missing that part in the book. So the bringing this into the table could help explain some of the regularities that we observe. For example, what kind of ladder are we talking about? Because if you observe the age formality profile, it is an inverse U shape. So in life, and the results of your study, formalization or transitions to formality occur more for prime age workers. So is it the accumulation of human capital, or is it the structure that is guiding these transitions? So, and in any case, the implications of this for macroeconomic policy or economic policies in general is, of course, that in economies which has such differentials, we should not focus only on stability and business cycles, but also on productive convergence and economic diversification, etc. And we, of course, could discuss at the country level or at the regional level, which is the best way to approach this, the clusters, the productivity development schemes, etc. But I would like to underline again these differentials. And for that, we have had recently access to this new data from the World Bank and the IMF 2 years ago. They produced data on informal production. And the overall picture is that some more or less 30% of global GDP is informal. But they use a very particular method, the underground economy approach, but in any case, it's an estimate. So we have an estimate that 60% of the labor force is informal. So if these two methodologies were comparable, that means that 40% of the formal labor force produces 70% of the global GDP. That is a differential of 4 times. We have calculated this for Africa, and it's like 16 times. So, and this has a lot of implications. For example, for human capital, there are some studies that show that returns to education are more or less half if you have an informal employment than if you have a formal employment, regardless if you move from one to the other, you see. And so the question would be here is if you consider that the job ladder also is affected by this type of productive heterogeneity. So that would be my point here.
Interesting. Get back together to discuss about this GDP figures of informal and formal, because that's super interesting to see. But in the interest of time, I just have a quick question to you, Sarah, and then I'll go by and give the floor to Professor Kunal Sen. So, governments are trying to address many of the social protection deficits that are there. But at the same time, we have a new elephant in the room that has come by, that is the new business models, such as the platform labor, where you have really worse working conditions and lack of social protection benefits and all of that. So one of the answers that's given by largely the Silicon Valley technocrats is that, well, you can solve all of this problem by giving universal basic income, right? Now, the question is, already developing countries are having a problem with the fiscal space, trying to find out enough resources to provide social protection, and with the custom duties and other cuts that are there, that's expenditure space is shrinking as we go by. So, how is it that countries can actually handle this entire issues with growing informality? Again, this is an angle, while we talk about transitions, with the platforms, what you see is the inverse, right? You have a lot more of employment becoming informal, both at the higher end too. So, how do we grapple with this entire issue as we move forward? Sorry for the big question to you.
No, I'll try to be brief on this. I think, the Silicon Valley, but many others, have been talking about the attractiveness of having some kind of a universal basic income, given that we have all this heterogeneity in the informal economy, platform work, other forms of informality. And I think the question always is, well, a universal basic income can be a very liberating idea. So everyone has a basic income, and then you can, become an artist, you can train, you can do all kinds of ideas. It's kind of Marx's idea of, this sort of the communist era, when we're all free from, having to sort of toil for our subsistence. But the reality is, I think the question we need to ask is how adequate this basic income is going to be. This is the real big question in the context of, the fiscal space issue that you ask. And I think some calculations that were done by the ILO that if we have a UBI that is at least at the level of a poverty, the national poverty lines, for 130 countries, the calculation was done, it would require a fiscal outlay of between 20 to 35% of GDP for most world regions. So this is massive. This is huge, right? If we really want to make it in any way adequate. Now, our idea of having universal social protection is not that everyone gets a basic income at every point in time. You get it when you need it. If you're unemployed, when you're on maternity, when you are old and you need old age. So the UBI is like giving every person a basic income. Now, this is fiscally quite a big proposition. So I think the worry is many of those, who are advocating for it, the question to ask is what this is going to displace if it actually happens. Is it going to be adequate? That's the first question. The second question is, if we have such big fiscal outlays, the risk is that we may then cut down on investments in public services, which are absolutely key and complementary, health, education, care services and so forth. And then the third point is that some of those who are advocating for it, not everyone, are also saying, again, then we have a UBI and we do away with a sort of contributory social insurance system, which again, is problematic because, we think if you have a social protection floor that is very, a basic floor, then, the ILO recommendation is that you also build on that and have the vertical dimension, and you have a contributory system as well for many of those who earn more and can contribute more and have better social protection. So the sort of risk is that with this idea of a UBI, we risk sort of doing away with some of the other key elements of a social policy system, including public services, including contributory system. So that I think is a major concern. And the other, if I can just end by saying what we really, I think, need to look at is look at those episodes that, Juan was mentioning of countries that in a relatively short period of time were able to formalize, and what policies did they use? And I think there's some really powerful lessons from, Uruguay, Brazil, Costa Rica, other countries in Latin America that used social protection to really extend coverage to people who didn't have contributory capacity, or to small and medium-sized enterprises. The monotax is a very good example that many of these countries had. They increased, the levels of coverage, and at the same time gradually formalized parts of the economy and created this potential virtuous circle through having higher productivity and better formalized enterprises that could then, increase earnings, invest in human capital, human capabilities, and create this virtuous circle that we really need to be able to then, through contributions and taxes, as a hybrid, financing mechanism, contribute a social protection system that gives coverage to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was a very nice summing up to say that social policies and the role of social policies, how important it is, not just at the individual worker level, but also trying to see how you can support enterprises and ensure that, workers get the benefit out of it. But I think it's not just alone social policies, including minimum wage policies, that are important, but I think, as Juan was saying, the entire macroeconomic sectoral policies, which play a very important role. Very clearly, there's no one size fits all. That's not where we get it to. But I think what we need to see is how do we bring about a productive transformation in these economies? How can we tailor policies that are very particular to the country or even to the region within that country, and try to see how the population can basically benefit from it. So with these words, I'm going to pass on the floor to you, Kunal, for your final reflections. And there's a question that I have from my colleague from SOCPRO about the difference between the upper and lower tier informal wage employment, and whether it is possible for the upper tier employment to go forward with lower inspection. Is it because that transition happens within the Latin American context, also because you have the labor inspection in place?
Okay, so I think, but I'm going to not try and start summarize everything that I said before. But I just want to, I think a few important points which I think is good to end with. So on the measurement part, Roger. So the point here is that if we agree that informal work is heterogeneous, and if we do agree that wage employment and informal employment are different in the way they are, then the thing is that we can think of conceptual schemas which try to capture this. And of course, then the question is whether written contracts makes any are important, or whether you should look at only ISCO 2 and 3 are important question. Which one? Ideally, what would we like to see? Ideally, we'd like to see all the data sets that we have worked with up in the public domain, right? All digitized and available, because it's all secondary data, so there's nothing confidential about that. And then researchers can play around and say, okay, if I do this, this happens. If I do that, if I change that, that happens. That would be ideal, isn't it? And I would hope that the ILO can join Univider on this, because it's quite remarkable that it's all these panel data sets. I mean, they are just not a place where we can get them from one area, one place, and yet they're so important for research and policy, right? And increasingly, there are more countries with panel data. And in fact, one could argue there should be more of this panel data sets, because unfortunately, the investment that is happening on this is not as much as one likes, right? So I think that, that I think will be really nice, because then you can start thinking about what really matters in classifying upper tiers and lower tier, and what's not so important, right? So I think that's the first point. Second point is on subsistence agriculture. Actually, we took it out so the real problem is sub-Saharan Africa, except South Africa, because it's not an issue in Latin America largely. It's not an issue in China. By the time we got to the rounds, the more recent data, it's not a big issue. India, actually, it's not as big as one might think. In India, it's mostly agricultural labor, wage labor, right? So it's sub-Saharan Africa, where there are lots of workers in subsistence agriculture, and we did actually take them out and see what happens. And then if we bring them in, what happens? So those, we can try and do that. And I agree that maybe we should keep them out, because they're a very tricky group to have. And then also makes it comparable, because then you have one continent where a lot of the informal subsistence agriculture, two other continents, three, well, Middle East also, where not much agriculture. And then this apples oranges problem that we're trying to avoid. So I think it's a really nice thing you should think about, and especially now, I think the ILO might, the new definition might actually anyway make us think a bit more carefully about that. So I think that's really good. On the question one about the growth versus informality question, very nice point about Latin America. See, two different phases. We haven't checked that. We should, because we do have the decadal data. We have 2 decades. We have the 2000s and the 2010s. Which I think encompasses the periods you're talking about. So it could be nice to check what's going on in within this sub periods, because we didn't really do that, because we just looked at the whole period itself, right? But one thing what's important is that it's quite clear the growth informality link, as you said, is not very strong, because if you look at India, which had one of the highest growth rates in that period, 2000s, really speaking, the group that hardly benefits is the lower tier, right? So something is going wrong somewhere in India if that growth is not percolating down to the lower tier, who are stuck there for, in fact, in the data we have in India, we have early 2000s, and then we have the 2012 round. So it's a 10-year span, by which time growth was happening in India quite a bit, right? So I think that's an interesting question about both about sub-period analysis, which we can do to understand the different dynamics of what happens and when growth is really happening in a particular set of countries versus not. And also the question of why do we see this weak link in some country contexts and perhaps more so in some other country context. Like China is an example where we have a stronger link, right? In fact, we didn't find, surprisingly, for other East Asian countries, could not find panel data apart from Indonesia. But I have a sense that in other East Asian countries, the link is quite strong also, like Vietnam, for example, right? So, that's an interesting question. Why here in this country and not in some other country is a really interesting question. So I think we should think about that. On the question of institutions versus economic factors, I think Latin America institutions played a very important role. Right. I think that definitely, I think the question of, for example, minimum wages and so on and so forth were very important. But institutions purposely plays a different role in India. Now, here, if anyone knows about Indian social systems, in India, we have a very strong classification by caste. Now, the lower tier, and we have this in the chapter, the lower tier is almost exclusively the lower caste, the lower tier informal, a lower tier informal wage employment is almost exclusively the lower caste. So the correlation between social structure and And informality is very strong in India, right? So there's a different way the institutions are playing a different role. And I think we should think a bit more carefully about those sort of traditional institutions, whatever you want to call it, because those are really can trump any other factor like growth or economic factors, because they are really the ones that are binding constraints to mobility or focus of that kind of group, right? So I think gender is of course important, but also in different, say in South Africa, race is also important too, right? So I think we need to be a bit more careful about understanding that there are non-economic factors that also explain lack of mobility. And those are really important to understand, right? So I think we should get back, that's a really important point. So Sarah, actually the point here, if you look at Latin America, right? So in our 20 cases, we could say we could have more, but still hopefully we have some representation across continents. In Latin America, the largest category was formal wage employment. So if you argue that it's to do with more generous social protection policies, more tighter labor regulations compared to Sub-Saharan Africa, there's a huge difference, right? Because Sub-Saharan Africa has very limited social protection policies, has limited labor regulation. But in fact, Latin America, we seem to see a large formal wage employment. So at least you could say that the argument that social protection policies or labor regulation has been a factor behind dampening formal wage employment doesn't seem to be holding true from the continent where we've seen much more of that. So I think that's an interesting point, really. And I think that's something that one should keep in mind that, it's not obvious. I'm not trying to make causal statements because it's difficult to know what explains this difference between continents. And again, South Africa, which has very tight labor regulation, also has a very generous social security provisions, we see a lot of formal wage employment by far in Africa, right? So I think we need to be careful about these links that are being made right now between social protection systems, or maybe even labor regulations, and formal wage employment, which is probably the category where you see the desired state, right? Because self-employment, as I was saying, is a fairly volatile state, formal self-employment. If that's a desired state, then it doesn't seem to be obvious that having more regulations, whatever, or tighter labor regulation are kind of constrain the growth of that segment, right? I think there's a debate about demand and supply side. In my view, I feel like these debates are just like not so interesting anymore. Because what's demand side, what's supply side here, I don't really think you can even say what's most important here. I think both are important. Supply side to do with education, training, skills are important. Demand side with economic growth. As long as growth is creating formal wage employment jobs, it's also important. So that's why in this particular book, we don't really take a stand on demand versus supply, because I think it's a bit of a very difficult issue to get into. So I think let's stop here. I just want to say that, the book is not meant to be the final answer to everything. And again, about sectoral transition, productive, those are things hopefully one can look at in the future. And I think the book is really sort of provide a set of stylized facts with the caveats that Roger pointed out, which hopefully then people can sort of say, okay, let's try to think more carefully, maybe get better measurement schemes. Let's try to think about what explains mobility and not, and try to understand the kind of causal factors in different countries. And so it's really a kind of starting point, I would hope. And ideally, if you can get the data sets all organized, and the people can look at the data more closely, and that also would be great, because I think there's a lot of potential research one can also do in this kind of area. So I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Professor Kunal Sen, for your wonderful presentation and this discussion. And I'd like to also thank Sarah, Roger, and Juan for very good interventions during this panel discussion. Thank you so much. And we'll see you all next week for the next seminar. Thanks for being with us. Goodbye.